Officer Greg Patterson had been working in law enforcement for over a decade. He was known for being strict, and some even called him unfair. Many officers respected him for being tough, but others noticed that he treated people differently based on how they looked. Some in the community whispered about his unfair treatment, but he had never faced serious trouble for it. One late afternoon, as the sun was setting, Greg was patrolling a quiet neighborhood when he noticed a car driving by. It wasn't speeding or breaking any rules, but something about it made him suspicious. He turned on his lights and siren, signaling the driver to pull over. The car slowed down and stopped at the side of the road. Inside the car sat Ava Carter, a 16-year-old high school student. She had just finished her after-school activities and was heading home. Ava was a bright student, always respectful, and never got into trouble. She loved reading, playing sports, and spending time with her family. That day, she had been excited about an upcoming event at school, but her excitement faded when she saw the flashing police lights behind her. Ava took a deep breath and did everything she had learned. She rolled down her window, placed her hands on the steering wheel, and waited. Officer Patterson walked up to the car, looking at her carefully. "License and registration," he said in a firm voice. Ava nodded and quickly reached for her bag. She handed over her documents, hoping this would be quick. "Did I do something wrong, officer?" she asked politely. Patterson looked over the papers and then back at her. "Your taillight is out," he said. Ava frowned. That didn't make sense. Her father always made sure the car was in perfect condition. "I didn't know that," she replied honestly. "I can call my dad in." "You don't need to call anyone," Patterson interrupted. He glanced at her hair, which was styled in long, neat braids. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Ava hesitated. She had never been asked to step out of the car before, especially over something as small as a taillight. But she didn't want to argue, so she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped outside. Patterson circled the car, acting like he was looking for something. Then he turned back to her. "Are you hiding anything?" he asked. Ava blinked in confusion. "Hiding what?" "In your hair," he said, his tone sharp. Ava's heart pounded. "No, sir. It's just my hair." Patterson crossed his arms. "Let me see," he said. Ava was stunned. "Sir, I promise." Before she could finish, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small knife. Before Ava could step back, he grabbed a section of her braids and, with a single motion, cut them off. A gasp escaped Ava's lips as she touched her hair in shock. Tears filled her eyes as she stared at the cut braids in his hand. Patterson, however, remained expressionless. "You're free to go," he said coldly, tossing the hair aside. Ava stood frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. Ava stood there, frozen in shock. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her beautiful braids, the ones her mother had carefully styled just days ago, now lay on the ground beside her feet. Her hands trembled as she touched the uneven ends of her hair. It didn't feel real. Officer Patterson gave her one last look before turning away, as if nothing had happened. "You can leave now," he said in a firm voice. Then, without another word, he walked back to his patrol car. Ava wanted to say something. She wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but her voice refused to come out. Instead, her eyes burned with unshed tears. She bent down, picked up the cut braids with shaking hands, and slowly got back into her car. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as she forced herself to take deep breaths. She couldn't stay there any longer. With a final glance in the rearview mirror, she started the car and drove away. But no matter how far she went, she couldn't escape the awful feeling inside her. As she reached home, she saw her mother, Lisa Carter, waiting at the door. Lisa's smile quickly faded when she noticed Ava's red eyes and the strands of hair clutched in her daughter's hand. "Ava, what happened?" she asked, stepping forward in concern. At those words, the emotions Ava had been holding in burst out. Tears streamed down her face as she explained everything. The stop, the accusations, and the moment Officer Patterson cut her hair. Lisa's hand shook with anger, but she forced herself to stay calm for her daughter. "Come inside," she said softly, leading Ava into the house. Ava's father, Judge Malcolm Carter, was in his study, finishing up some work. When he heard the door open, he stepped out to greet them, but the moment he saw Ava's face, he knew something was terribly wrong. "Ava, what's the matter?" he asked, his deep voice filled with concern. Lisa took a deep breath and explained everything. As she spoke, Malcolm's expression changed. His usual calm and collected face darkened with anger, but he remained quiet until his wife was done. Then he turned to Ava, his eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. "Did anyone else see what happened?" he asked. Ava sniffled and nodded. "There was a woman on the sidewalk. I think she was recording." Lisa immediately pulled out her phone and checked social media. It didn't take long to find the video. It was already spreading fast, and hundreds of people were commenting, outraged by what they had just witnessed. Malcolm sat down and took a deep breath. He had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom, but now justice had to be served in his own home. "This isn't over," he said firmly. "That officer is going to regret what he did." The next morning, Ava woke up feeling exhausted. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her heart still felt heavy. She touched her uneven hair and sighed. Every time she looked in the mirror, she was reminded of what had happened. Downstairs, her parents were already awake, talking in low but serious voices. When Ava walked into the kitchen, her mother gave her a warm hug. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Lisa asked gently. "I don't know," Ava admitted. "It still doesn't feel real." Her father, Judge Malcolm Carter, set his coffee cup down and looked at her. His face was calm, but his eyes were filled with determination. "Ava, we are going to make sure that officer answers for what he did," he said. "But first, I need to know if you're ready for this. Things might get big." Ava took a deep breath. She was scared, but she also felt something new, anger mixed with courage. She nodded. "I want people to know the truth." Lisa smiled proudly, then held up her phone. "The video has already gone viral. People are furious. They're demanding that the officer be held responsible." Ava glanced at the screen. Thousands of comments filled the post. Some people were shocked, some were angry, and others were offering their support. She even saw a few messages from people she didn't know, telling her to stay strong. Just then, Malcolm's phone rang. He picked it up and listened for a moment before nodding. "That was the police chief," he said after hanging up. "They've put Officer Patterson on administrative leave. They want to meet with us today." Ava's heart pounded. "What does that mean?" "It means they know they're in trouble," Malcolm replied, "and they want to talk before this situation gets worse for them." A few hours later, Ava and her parents arrived at the police department. As they walked inside, several officers glanced at them, some looking uncomfortable. A receptionist led them to a conference room, where the police chief and other officials were waiting. Chief Anderson, a tall man with gray hair, greeted them. "Judge Carter, Mrs. Carter, Ava, please have a seat," he said. His voice was polite, but there was tension in the air. "We've seen the video. Let me start by saying that what happened should not have happened. Officer Patterson's actions were unacceptable." Ava stared at him. She wasn't sure if he was being sincere or just trying to calm things down. Malcolm leaned forward. "And what do you plan to do about it?" His voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to it. The chief cleared his throat. "An investigation is underway. But in the meantime, we would like to discuss a peaceful resolution." Lisa scoffed. "A peaceful resolution?" She looked at Ava's uneven hair. Our daughter was humiliated by someone who was supposed to protect her. Ava remained silent, waiting to hear what they had to say. But deep down, she already knew this wasn't going to be easy. Ava sat quietly in the meeting room, listening as the police chief tried to explain their position. The air in the room felt heavy. She could tell that her parents were just as tense as she was. Her father sat with his hands folded, watching the chief closely, while her mother's arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. Chief Anderson sighed and leaned forward. "We understand that what happened was wrong, and we are taking this matter very seriously," he said. "Officer Patterson has been placed on leave while we conduct an investigation." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Leave? That's all?" The chief shifted uncomfortably. "For now, yes, but we want to work with you to find a solution that benefits everyone. We don't want this situation to get out of control." Lisa frowned. "Out of control," she repeated. "You mean you don't want bad publicity?" The chief hesitated but didn't argue. "Look, I understand that you're upset, Mrs. Carter. We all saw the video. It was unfortunate." Ava clenched her fists under the table. Unfortunate. That was all they had to say. She had been humiliated, and they were acting like this was just an accident. Malcolm's voice was calm but firm. "My daughter was publicly mistreated by one of your officers. This was not an accident. It was a choice, and now you want us to just accept an investigation while he gets to stay home." The chief rubbed his forehead. "We have procedures we have to follow," he explained. "But I assure you, Officer Patterson will face consequences if found guilty." Lisa scoffed. "If." Ava finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "What if there was no video?" she asked. "Would you still be sitting here, telling us you're taking this seriously?" The chief didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down for a moment before clearing his throat. "The truth is, the video has brought a lot of attention to this case. The mayor himself has expressed concern. That's why we're here. We want to know if there's a way to handle this situation without making it worse for everyone involved." Ava's father sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "Let me make this clear," he said. "We are not looking for a quiet deal. We want real action. We want Officer Patterson to be held accountable, and we want real changes in how officers treat people in this city." Lisa nodded in agreement, "And we won't stop until that happens." The chief sighed again. "I understand," he said. "We will proceed with the investigation. But I should warn you, this might take time." Ava knew what that meant. They were hoping people would forget. They wanted the attention to die down, but she wasn't going to let that happen. As they left the police department, Ava took a deep breath. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure no one else went through what she had. And she was ready for the fight ahead. As Ava and her parents left the police department, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had hoped for more. She had wanted to hear that Officer Patterson would be fired immediately, that justice would be swift, that the pain she felt would be acknowledged in a real way. But instead, all they got were carefully chosen words and promises of an investigation. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Reporters with cameras and microphones stood nearby, ready to catch any statement. Community members had also shown up, some holding signs, others simply there to show support. The video of what had happened to her was still spreading, and it had reached people far beyond their neighborhood. As soon as Ava and her family stepped out, reporters rushed toward them. "Ava, how are you feeling?" one of them asked. "What do you want to say to the police department?" Ava looked at her father, unsure of what to do. Malcolm gave her a small nod, silently telling her that it was her choice. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face the cameras. "I don't want to be standing here," she said honestly. "I didn't ask for this to happen to me. I was just trying to go home that day." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "But now that it has happened, I can't ignore it. No one should have to go through what I went through. No one should be treated unfairly just because of how they look. I want real justice, not just words." The reporters continued shouting questions, but Malcolm stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Ava's shoulder. "That's all for now," he said firmly, leading Ava and Lisa toward their car. As they drove home, Ava's phone kept buzzing. Friends were messaging her, Teachers from school were checking in, and even people she didn't know were sending supportive messages. But mixed in with the kind words were also some cruel ones. People who were trying to downplay what had happened, saying it wasn't a big deal or that she was making too much out of it. Ava sighed and put her phone down. "Why are some people like this?" she asked. "Why do they act like this isn't a problem?" Lisa turned to her and gave her a gentle look. "Because some people don't want to admit there's a problem," she said. "If they do, then they have to do something about it. And change scares people." Ava nodded, though it still frustrated her. She knew that no matter what, she wasn't going to let this fade away. Later that evening, Malcolm got another phone call. His face remained calm as he listened, but Ava could tell something was happening. When he hung up, he looked at Ava and Lisa. "Patterson is demanding a meeting," he said. "He wants to talk." Ava felt her stomach tighten. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face him again, but she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't stay silent. She wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of her was angry. Why should she have to sit down with a man who humiliated her? Another part of her was nervous. What could he possibly say to make up for what he did? Lisa crossed her arms. "What does he want to say now?" she asked, clearly not trusting the idea. Malcolm exhaled slowly. His lawyer called. "They said he wants to talk privately before things go any further." Ava frowned. "Privately? That sounds like he just wants to cover this up." Her father nodded. "It's possible, but we're not going into this blindly. If we agree to meet, it will be on our terms, and I want you to be the one to decide, Ava. If you don't want to see him, we won't do it." Ava took a deep breath. This wasn't something she ever imagined herself doing. But deep inside, she felt like she needed to hear what he had to say. "I'll do it," she finally said, "but only if it's in a place where we have control. And I want it recorded." Malcolm gave her an approving nod. "Then that's what we'll do." The next day, the meeting was set to take place at a neutral location, a law office, where everything would be documented. As Ava and her parents walked in, she felt her heart pounding. She wasn't afraid, but she was anxious. A few minutes later, the door opened and Officer Patterson walked in. For the first time, he didn't look confident. He didn't have the same cold, uncaring expression she remembered from that day. Instead, he looked uncomfortable, as if he wasn't sure what to say. His lawyer sat beside him, but all eyes were on Patterson. There was a long silence before he finally spoke. I just wanted to say that what I did was wrong," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I shouldn't have done that to you." Ava stared at him. She didn't know what she expected, but it wasn't this. Lisa leaned forward. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Patterson hesitated, then looked down. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been a cop for a long time, and sometimes I just—" He stopped, shook his head, and sighed. "The truth is, I judged you before I even spoke to you, and I was wrong." Ava's hands clenched under the table. "You didn't just judge me. You humiliated me. You made me feel like I was nothing." Patterson's face tensed. "I know," he said, "and I regret it." Ava could hear the words, but did he really mean them? Or was he just saying this because he got caught? She wasn't sure yet, but she knew one thing: an apology wasn't enough. Ava sat in silence for a moment, letting Officer Patterson's words sink in. "I regret it." Those words should have meant something, but they felt empty. She wasn't sure if he truly regretted his actions or if he just regretted getting caught. She looked at him carefully. His hands were folded on the table, his face tense. He seemed uncomfortable, maybe even embarrassed. But was that enough? Could one meeting erase the pain he had caused? Her father, Malcolm, broke the silence. His voice was calm, but there was strength behind it. "Regret is not enough, Officer Patterson," he said. "Regret doesn't undo what happened. Regret doesn't fix my daughter's hair. Regret doesn't erase the humiliation she felt." Patterson looked down. "I know," he admitted. "I can't take it back. But I want to make it right. Ava's mother, Lisa, scoffed. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Patterson sighed and glanced at his lawyer before speaking again. I'm willing to make a public apology. I'll take full responsibility. I'll admit what I did was wrong. Ava raised an eyebrow. And then what? You go back to your job like nothing happened. Patterson shook his head. I don't know if I'll even have a job after this. The department is still investigating me. Ava felt a mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to feel satisfied that he was finally facing consequences, but another part of her knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. You're not the only officer who's treated people like this, she said. What are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else? Patterson exhaled deeply. He seemed to struggle with his next words. I can speak out about it, he said. I can use my mistake to teach other officers what not to do. I don't expect forgiveness, but maybe I can do something good with this. Ava glanced at her parents. Her father's expression was unreadable, but her mother still looked doubtful. You humiliated me in public, Ava said, keeping her voice steady. If you're truly sorry, then you need to apologize in public. Not just to me, but to everyone you've disrespected. Patterson nodded. I'll do it, he said, if that's what it takes to make things right. But Ava wasn't sure anything could truly make things right. She had already lost something that day. Her trust, her dignity, and the sense of safety she once had. Still, if this situation could lead to real change, she was willing to see it through. But she also knew one thing for sure. An apology was only the first step. In the days that followed, things began to change for Ava. She had expected some level of resolution, but she wasn't prepared for just how much this event would shift the way people looked at her, and the way she looked at herself. The video of her encounter with Officer Patterson had continued to spread online, and her story became a rallying point for people who had been treated unfairly in similar situations. Support poured in from all sides, some from people she knew, but also from strangers who sent messages of encouragement. They shared their own stories, their own struggles, and they thanked her for being brave enough to speak up. It wasn't just online. At school, many of her classmates, especially those who had seen the video, approached her with kindness. Some apologized, some just offered silent support with a simple smile or a nod. Ava's teachers, too, expressed their sympathy, and some had even started discussions in class about the issues raised by the incident. But even with all the support, Ava still felt a sense of unease. The pain from that day hadn't completely faded. There were still times when she would catch herself reaching for her hair, only to remember the way it had been carelessly cut. But something else was growing inside her now, a resolve. She wasn't just going to let this experience define her. She was going to use it as a catalyst for change. Ava's parents were fully behind her. Malcolm continued to push for more than just an apology from the department. He worked with other community leaders and organizations to ensure that the police force implemented better training on how to treat people with respect, no matter their background. They organized town hall meetings and discussions where people could openly talk about their experiences with law enforcement. It wasn't just about Ava anymore. It was about creating a better system for everyone. Officer Patterson, as promised, made his public apology. He stood before a camera, visibly uncomfortable, but sincere. He admitted that he had wrongfully judged Ava, and he expressed regret for the harm he had caused. His apology was broadcasted to the city, and while some people accepted it, others felt that it wasn't enough. But it wasn't just about what he did. It was about what would come next. Ava watched the apology, and though it didn't take away the sting of what happened, it was a start. She knew that for real change to happen, it had to be more than just one officer saying sorry. It had to be a shift in the entire system. She realized then that her journey wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. Ava began speaking out at events and sharing her story in front of larger audiences. With every word, her confidence grew. She talked about how vital it was to treat people with dignity and respect, no matter their background. She shared how small actions, like cutting someone's hair, could have a profound impact on their sense of self-worth. Ava knew that her experience wasn't isolated. She was just one of many, and if she could help make a difference, she would. As the months passed, the incident slowly became a chapter in Ava's life, but it wasn't the final chapter. She kept fighting for the changes she believed in, and in the process, she began to realize something important. She had found her voice. And with that voice, Ava knew she could do more than just speak up for herself. She could speak up for anyone who had been made to feel small, forgotten, or unimportant. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about creating a world where no one would ever have to experience that kind of humiliation again. She had learned, through all the pain and heartache, that sometimes the worst experiences can lead to the most important journeys. And for Ava, that journey was just beginning.